representative of Poland. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank Mr. Lowcock for the report on the humanitarian situation in Syria. And first of all, we would like to comment the adoption of the Security Council resolution just happened, which extended the mandate for the cross-border delivery of humanitarian assistance into Syria. Our attitude to that, to put it mildly, not transparent mechanism is something that's well known. And the new realities in the Syrian Arab Republic are such that what is required is to fine-tune this mechanism with the ultimate goal being to gradually but inevitably wrap it up. And this view is not reflected in the resolution, and it determined our vote. We decided not to block the decision because of humanitarian considerations and also taking into account the appeals from our partners in the region. At the same time, we would like to note that the text of the document is divorced from reality, is compiled using the four-year-old patterns. In particular, why keep in the list of cross-border checkpoints the one in Derar Ramta? Because on the Syrian side, it has already for a long time been under control of the Syrian officials. We are going to follow up very closely how the humanitarian assistance is going to be supplied through cross-border mechanism and require proper transparency and accountability. What is in need of serious review is also the way the Secretariat prepares reports on the humanitarian situation in Syria. The document does not have such important points as help in rebuilding infrastructure, the trend of the refugees to return, the impact of unilateral sanctions on the people's lives, and mine action issues. We call upon colleagues to review their inflexible approaches, which have little to do with the current situation in Syria, but rather to join in joint work on improving the difficult socioeconomic situation in the country, in restoring that was destroyed by the terrorists, providing for the inalienable rights of refugees and IDPs to return. In this context, we note what was said by the High Commission on Refugees that 250,000 Syrians are ready to return home next year. We think it is unseemly to be selective in providing assistance to the Syrian population. Politicizing the issues of humanitarian assistance is unacceptable. One cannot openly blame the Syrian government and at the same time ignore the unilateral steps undertaken by other actors in the Syrian conflict. It is at least unethical to pretend that Raqqa does not exist. We know that 80% of the civilian municipal infrastructure is in ruins. People's bodies are still being pulled from the rubble. This is a result of the campaign to free the people from ISIL, and more than 8,000 people were victims of this campaign. By the way, the proposal to have humanitarian pauses in order to move the civilians away from danger was not supported by anyone at the time. We need to urgently decide two issues which are critical to improve the situation in Syria. First, immediately lifting the unilateral sanctions introduced by some states. These restrictions are damaging first and foremost for the ordinary Syrians. And by the way, this is something that's accepted by independent experts, including UN experts. Secondly, we need to end the illegal occupation of Syrian territory. It undermines the integrity and sovereignty of the country and also strengthens the separatist trends in the countries. This is a threat for the national security of neighboring states. Deoccupying the 55-kilometer security zone, the so-called security zone organized by the United States around the Syrian at Tanf would be the main precondition in order to resolve the Rukban issue. As we know, the conditions in this camp, which houses, according to various estimates, about 50,000 people, are very difficult, very close to humanitarian catastrophe. The people there are basically held hostages by the illegal armed groups who are active there and linked to ISIL. Given the deteriorating situation in the camp, Russia supported the sending in November into Rukban of humanitarian UN convoy and participated and undertook major efforts, including with the government of Syria, to do that. Unfortunately, organizing this humanitarian operation within the 55-kilometer zone was unsatisfactory. The way the humanitarian assistance was distributed, this was something that the fighters from Magavir Asauma it was given over to them. And the UN personnel and the Syrian Red Crescent had very limited access to the distribution of humanitarian assistance, which means that part of it ended up with the fighters. On this basis, we think that the next supply of humanitarian assistance of Rukban is something that needs to be carefully thought through, and the shortcomings of the first convoy need to be done away with. We need to agree the parameters, ensuring that there is a maximum possible level of transparency and targeted distribution of assistance without the participation of illegal armed groups. And the American side, which is occupying this area, need to be in charge of that. The fact that the stabilizing trends are strengthening in Syria is undeniable. Despite remaining problems, there are positive steps in improving the humanitarian situation, and this is most noticeable in those territories which are under the control of Damascus. As we stated more than once, this is a critical moment, and the international community needs to now give a helping hand to the Syrians in order to overcome the devastation and making sure that people who are voluntarily deciding to return can live normally. By the way, the overall number of those people who are returning are in the tens of thousands. Mr. President, we've heard today from our American colleagues a disinformation raised to the power of two. In April, when in Eastern Duma there was a trumped-up attack, the Syrian government was accused of that, the chemical attack, and the outcome of the investigation is something we still don't know today. The experts are still collecting something. I wonder whether this isn't because admitting that this is a provocation would mean also accepting that you're responsible for the illegal aggression in the April, which and this provocation was used as a pretext for this aggression. Now, when we have reliable information about the chlorine ammunition used by the fighters, which used them before as well, and this was accepted by our partners, our Western partners as well. Well, they invented a new tactic now, and they accuse Syria and Russia of disinformation, of trumping this up. The Syrian government invited specialists from the OPCW to come to Syria. But for some reason, they're in no hurry to arrive. They are studying something remotely. But there are other places that we know they were desperate to come to very, very quickly. But they collected facts in areas which were very far removed from areas of incident. Now, Washington is created a formulation which is also used by London as well. This was done by the Syrian government in order to poison their own citizens and accuse the fighters of doing that. This is very clumsy, ladies and gentlemen. Your propaganda is something that we can see through very clearly. Mr. President, the situation in Idlib is in the focus of the countries which are guarantors of the Astana process within the Memorandum on Stabilization of 17th September of this year. It is also necessary to understand that the importance of sustainable ceasefire does not mean that one should give up on effectively fighting terrorism. We note serious efforts made by the Turkish side within the framework of their commitments to separate terrorist and moderate groups. What would be helpful here would be educating these groups on the part of those who initially nurtured them, because their goal was to change the legal government. This would be a more fundamental contribution to the settlement rather than the groundless continuous claims to Russia and other states and telling them what and how to do. Russia and other countries' guarantors continue working intensively in the political area within the context of the decision in Sochi to form a constitutional committee. The negotiations are now have become particularly intensive at this stage. We're still thinking that all of the parameters for the committee is something that needs to be approved by the Syrians themselves, and this is the only way the Constitutional Committee will be effective and workable. Let me underscore the following. The Constitutional Committee is not something that has a viable alternative. We call upon everyone to include in collective work to create something that of basic need for Syria, Middle East, and the whole international community, and that is a comprehensive political process under the aegis of the UN and in line with the Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.